Welcome back to HOA Karen Patrol. The permit was fine until she decided it was not. Karen blocked my driver door with a clipboard and shouted that the tow was already authorized and my appeal window was closed. You are out of warnings, and I am done being nice. Her reflective safety vest caught the amber strobes from the tow truck idling 20 feet behind her, and the tire clamp in the guy's hand looked ready to snap shut the second I stepped back. I work as a fleet mechanic for the municipal garage in Greenville, South Carolina, and I know tow procedures cold. This was not legal, it was not proper notice, and it sure as hell was not happening to my car. The Stonehaven HOA had been gunning for me for 3 months over guest parking, permit decals, and a rotating circus of fire lane complaints, but tonight they crossed a line I could prove. My elderly mother is staying with me while she recovers from surgery, and the stress of constant notices and threats is making everything harder. I pulled out my phone, held it chest high, and started recording. Karen's eyes flicked to the lens, and her jaw tightened. Behind her, a rideshare driver sat in his car with the window cracked, rolling his eyes like he had seen this show before. I took one slow breath. The air smelled like wet asphalt and diesel exhaust. Puddles reflected the amber lights in jagged streaks, and every few seconds the tow truck's hydraulic lift hissed like it was warming up. Karen tapped the clipboard twice with her pen, hard enough that the sound carried. She said, "This vehicle has been flagged for 24 hours in guest parking without a valid decal, and per section 9.4 of the community standards, you waived your appeal rights when you ignored the email blast." I asked her what email blast. She blinked. I said, "Show me the timestamp." She said, "I do not owe you explanations. You owe the HOA compliance." The tow driver stepped closer with the clamp, boots squelching in a puddle, and I held up one hand. I said, "You put that clamp on my wheel before I see proof of notice, and I will have the police here in 2 minutes with a harassment complaint." Karen's face went red. She said, "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule." That phrase again. She had used it in the parking lot 2 weeks ago, at the mailboxes last month, and in a voicemail she left after I questioned a guest pass rejection. It was her favorite line, and every time she said it, I made a note. The tow driver looked at Karen, then at me, then at his clamp. He said, "Lady, if he is saying no notice, I need to see the work order signed." Karen snapped, "It is signed, it is authorized, and it is none of his business who signed it." She flipped the clipboard around and shoved it toward my face. I leaned in and read the slip. It had my plate number, my address, and a checkbox next to 24-hour violation. The authorization signature line had a scrawl I could not read, and the date stamp said 3 days ago. I said, "This says you marked my car on the 19th. Today is the 22nd. That is 72 hours, not 24. Karen pulled the clipboard back and said, "The clock starts when we post the notice, not when you see it." I said, "Where is the notice photo?" She said, "We do not owe you photos, we owe you enforcement." The tow driver shifted his weight and said, "I am not touching this without a door hanger photo or a dashboard sticker timestamp." Karen's face went from red to purple. She said, "I have done this before, and people fold every time. You need to do your job, or I will call your supervisor." The driver shrugged and said, "Call him. I will wait." Then he walked back to his truck and leaned against the fender, arms crossed. I stayed polite, because polite makes bullies careless. I said, "Karen, I am happy to clear this up, but I need to see the original notice and the email you mentioned." She said, "The email went to the entire neighborhood. Check your spam." I said, "I checked. Nothing there." She said, "That is your problem, not mine." I said, "If there is no proof of notice, then there is no valid tow authorization, and you need to leave my vehicle alone." She jabbed a finger at my chest, close enough that I took a step back. She said, "You have been a problem resident since day one. You park guests in fire lanes. You let your mother use a handicap spot without a placard, and you refuse to follow the decal system." I said, "My mother has a valid placard. My guests park in marked guest spaces, and I have never been cited for a fire lane in my life." She said, "You are cited now, and your appeal window is closed." I asked her what appeal window. She said, "The one in the email." I said, "Show me the email." She said, "I do not carry my laptop to enforcement calls." I said, "Then call someone who does." She turned and walked toward the tow truck, and I heard her mutter something about entitled residents and wasted time. The driver gave me a look that said good luck and climbed into his cab. Karen pulled a phone from her blazer pocket and made a call. I could not hear the other side, but I heard her say, "He is refusing to cooperate, he is recording me, and he is threatening to call the police if we proceed." She paused. Then she said, "Fine, I will document the refusal and we will issue the escalated fee structure." She hung up and turned back to me. She said, "You just bought yourself a $500 obstruction fine on top of the tow and storage fees you will owe when we come back with proper compliance enforcement." I said, "You are not coming back without a valid notice trail." She said, "We will see." Then she motioned to the tow driver, who started his engine and backed out of the space without touching my car. Karen walked past me, close enough that her shoulder brushed mine, and said, "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule." Then she got into a white sedan with an HOA placard on the dash and drove off, leaving me standing in the puddles with my phone still recording and my heart pounding hard enough to hurt. I saved the video and texted it to my friend Marcus, a local paralegal who helps me organize evidence packets when things get legal. I have a notary appointment booked for tomorrow morning, and missing it delays my sworn statements for weeks, so I needed to move fast. Marcus replied in under a minute. He said, "That is gold. Send me the clipboard close-up and any prior notices you have." I walked back to my front door, unlocked it, and went straight to the kitchen table, where I keep a folder of every HOA notice, email, and fine I have received since I moved here 8 months ago. The folder is 2 inches thick. Most of it is garbage. Violation notices for grass height on days I mowed. Guest parking complaints for cars that were not mine. A formal warning about a trash can left out past 7 in the morning when the photo timestamp shows 6:58. The HOA prefers one tow vendor and tries to sabotage any other company, so I had started documenting every tow threat and every vendor interaction. Tonight was the 4th time they tried to tow me, and the first time they actually brought the truck and the clamp. I found the tow yard receipt that keeps showing up in my mailbox. It is always the same company, same logo, same blank line for vehicle description. I have 3 of them now, all postmarked before any alleged tow happened. They are scare tactics. I took a photo of all 3 and sent them to Marcus. Then I found the guest parking rulebook I got when I signed the lease. It says guests can park in designated guest spaces for up to 72 hours with a pass displayed on the dashboard. It says nothing about decals, It says nothing about email blasts. It says the HOA must provide written notice of a violation and allow 48 hours for correction before any tow authorization. Karen skipped all of it. I pulled out my laptop and checked my email again. Nothing from the HOA in 3 weeks. The last message was a reminder about the annual meeting, which I attended, and where Karen spent 15 minutes talking about parking enforcement as if it were a war we were losing. My mother called from the guest room. She said, "Is everything okay out there?" I said, "Yes, just HOA nonsense." She said, "They are not trying to tow your car again, are they?" I said, "They tried, but I stopped it." She said, "You should not have to deal with this. I feel like I am making it worse by being here." I said, "You are not making anything worse. The HOA is just abusing the rules because they can." She said, "Maybe I should go stay with your sister for a while." I said, "No, you are recovering here where I can help, and I am going to fix this." I heard her sigh, and then the sound of her TV turning on. I went back to the folder and kept sorting. There had to be something that proved Karen was backdating notices or skipping the process. I found a notice from 6 weeks ago about a guest vehicle that supposedly stayed 4 days. The notice was dated on a Thursday, but the photo metadata showed it was taken on a Saturday. I checked the timestamp against my security camera footage. The guest car left Friday night. The notice was a lie. I added it to the packet. Marcus called. He said, "This is ugly. They are issuing authorizations without proper notice, and they are using a vendor that does not verify. You need to file a police report for harassment and get an incident number before they try again." I said, "I have a notary appointment in the morning. Can I do both?" He said, "Yes, but do the police report first. Because if they show up with a truck again tonight, you want that report number on file." I said, "They would not come back tonight." He said, "Karen would. She is escalating, and she does not care about rules." I looked out the front window. The street was quiet. My car was still in the same spot. No clamp, no sticker. I said, "Okay, I will call it in." Marcus said, "Good. And send me everything you have by 9 tonight so I can review it before your notary appointment." I said, "Will do." He said, "One more thing. Check the county recorder tomorrow and see if they filed a lien yet. If they did, you need to challenge it immediately." I said, "How would they file a lien without a judgment?" He said, "Some HOAs file anyway and hope you do not notice. It is illegal, but it works if you are not paying attention." I said, "I am paying attention." He said, "I know. That is why you are going to win." Then he hung up. I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. The dispatcher said an officer would come by to take a report. 20 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up and a young officer knocked on my door. I showed him the video, the folder, the tow authorization slip in the sleeve, and the guest parking rulebook. He took notes and said, "This is a civil matter between you and the HOA, but if they tow your car without proper notice, that is theft of property, and you can press charges." I said, "Can you put that in the report?" He said, "Yes, and I will include the video evidence and the inconsistencies you showed me." I said, "Thank you." He said, "One more thing. If they show up again tonight, call us immediately and reference this incident number." He handed me a card with the number written on it. I took a photo of the card and sent it to Marcus. The officer left, and I locked the door behind him. I spent the next hour organizing everything into a timeline. Guest car arrives. Guest car parks in space 14. HOA, notice claims violation, but photo metadata proves the notice was taken 2 days after the car left. Tow authorization slip dated 3 days ago, but no prior notice in my email or mailbox. Karen on video threatening escalated fees and refusing to provide proof of notice. Tow driver refusing to clamp my car without a photo trail. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The HOA was ignoring my proof and demanding the same thing again in a new format, hoping I would give up or miss a deadline. But I do not miss deadlines. I sent the packet to Marcus at 8:57, 3 minutes before his deadline. He replied, "Got it, this is bulletproof. See you at the notary at 9. I went to bed, but did not sleep. Every car that passed outside sounded like a tow truck. Every door slam sounded like Karen coming back. I checked my security camera feed twice. At 2 in the morning, I gave up and made coffee. My mother came out in her robe and said, "You are still up." I said, "Just making sure the car is still there." She said they would not come back in the middle of the night. I said Karen would. She shook her head and said, "This is no way to live." I said, "I know, but it will be over soon." She said, "How can you be sure?" I said, "Because I have proof, and proof wins." She said, "Proof only wins if someone looks at it." I said, "Someone will. I am making sure of it." She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. She said, "What is the plan?" I said, "Notary appointment at 9. Then I file the complaint with the county and request an independent audit of the HOA's towing records." She said, "Will they actually do an audit?" I said, "They have to if I can prove a pattern of abuse." She said, "And you can prove it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good, then let us get through tomorrow and see what happens." At 8:50 the next morning, I was in the car heading to the notary office. My mother stayed home to rest. Marcus met me in the parking lot with a leather portfolio and a pen. He said, "I reviewed everything. It is airtight, but you need to add one more thing." I said, "What?" He said, "A statement about the email blast Karen keeps claiming she sent. If she sent it, there is a record on the server. If there is no record, she is lying. Request a server log dump as part of your complaint." I said, "How do I do that?" He said, "I will add the language to your affidavit. You just need to sign it in front of the notary." I said, "Done." We went inside, and the notary, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, reviewed the documents and watched me sign 4 copies. She stamped each one and said, "You are taking on your HOA." I said yes. She said, "Good luck. They are a nightmare around here." I said, "I am hearing that a lot." She smiled and said, "You have good documentation. That is half the battle." I said, "What is the other half?" She said, "Staying calm when they try to make you explode." I said, "I am working on it." Marcus and I walked back to the parking lot, and he said, "Now you file this with the county clerk and request the audit. The clerk will forward it to the state compliance office if the HOA is registered, which Stonehaven is. Once that happens, they have 30 days to respond, or they face penalties." I said, "What kind of penalties?" He said, "Fines, suspension of enforcement powers, and in extreme cases, dissolution of the board." I said, "Dissolution sounds good." He laughed and said, "It rarely happens, but the threat of it makes them settle." I said, I do not want a settlement. I want them to stop. He said, you will get both. I said, how do you know? He said, because Karen is sloppy, and sloppy always loses. I said, she does not act sloppy. He said, she acts confident, but confidence without documentation is just noise. I said, I like that. He said, use it. Then he handed me a business card and said, if this goes to a hearing, call me and I will sit with you. I said, thank you. He said, no problem. I hate bullies. Then he got in his car and drove off. If you are enjoying this story, hit subscribe and the like button so you do not miss the next HOA nightmare and how it ends. I drove to the county clerk's office and filed the complaint. The clerk, a man in his 40s with a name tag that said Brian, read the cover page and said, another Stonehaven complaint. I said, you have seen others. He said 3 this month. I said, same issue. He said, towing, mostly, and some lien abuse. I said, are they being investigated? He said, I cannot comment on active cases, but I can tell you that multiple complaints about the same HOA get escalated faster. I said, good to know. He stamped my filing and said, you should hear back in 2 weeks, maybe sooner if they prioritize it. I said, thank you. He said, one more thing. If they try to retaliate before the audit happens, file an emergency motion and we can freeze their enforcement powers temporarily. I said, how do I do that? He said, come back here and ask for the emergency intake desk. They will walk you through it. I said, okay. He handed me a copy of the stamped filing and said, keep this with you. It is proof you are in the system. I left the clerk's office feeling like I had finally done something that mattered. By the time I got home, it was almost noon. My mother was in the living room watching television. She said, how did it go? I said, filed and stamped. She said, now we wait. I said, now we wait. She said, do you think they will leave you alone while the audit is pending? I said, no. She said, what do you think they will do next? I said, escalate. She said, how? I said, email blast framing me as the one resident who refuses community standards. She said, can they do that? I said, they already did it once. They will do it again. She said, what happens if they do? I said, I prove it is defamatory and add it to the complaint. She said, you are very calm about this. I said, I am not calm. I am just focused. She said, good, because I would be losing my mind. I said, I am losing my mind internally. I am just not showing it. She laughed and said, that is called being an adult. I said, I guess so. That afternoon, I checked my email and found a message from the Stonehaven HOA master account. The subject line said, Community Standards Update and Non-Compliant Resident Behavior. I opened it and read the first paragraph. It said, recent enforcement actions have revealed a pattern of resistance from certain residents who believe the rules do not apply to them. These residents have caused delays in towing, blocked compliance officers, and threatened legal action over routine enforcement. The board reminds all homeowners that the rules are for everyone, and refusal to comply will result in escalated fees and possible legal action by the HOA. I scrolled down. The email did not name me, but it described my car, my address block, and the exact date of the tow attempt. It was obvious to anyone reading it. I forwarded the email to Marcus and said, Exhibit A for defamation. He replied, Save it, print it, and add it to your file. If they do this again, we can request an injunction. I said, How many times do they have to do it before we get an injunction? He said, Twice is usually enough if you can show harm. I said, Define harm. He said, Financial loss, emotional distress, damage to reputation. I said, I have all three. He said, Then we are good. I printed the email and put it in the folder. That evening I went out to check my mailbox and found another tow yard receipt tucked inside. It was the fourth one. Same company, same blank line, same threat. I took it inside and added it to the folder. My mother said, They are really pushing. I said, They think I will fold. She said, Will you? I said, No. She said, What if they actually tow the car next time? I said, Then I file charges for theft and sue them for the tow and storage fees plus damages. She said, That sounds expensive. I said it will be for them. She said, You are scaring me a little. I said, Good. Karen should be scared too. My mother shook her head and went back to her room. I stayed up late reviewing the timeline again. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The HOA was violating open meeting rules, and it backfired the moment I cite the statute. I had checked the state HOA compliance website earlier and found the statute. It said all enforcement actions must be approved in an open meeting with recorded minutes available to homeowners within 10 days. I requested the minutes from the last 3 months and got nothing. That was another violation. I added it to the list. 2 days later, I got a call from a number I did not recognize. I answered, and a man said, This is Rick from Stonehaven Property Management. I am calling about your vehicle and some concerns the board has raised. I said, What concerns? He said, The board believes your vehicle has been parked in guest spaces without proper authorization, and they have asked me to schedule a compliance inspection. I said, A compliance inspection of what? He said, Your vehicle, your parking habits, and your guest log. I said, I do not have a guest log. He said, All residents are required to maintain a guest log per Section 12.2 of the Community Standards. I said, I have never seen Section 12.2. He said, It is in the updated handbook distributed last quarter. I said, I never received an updated handbook. He said, It was mailed to all residents. I said, I never got it. He said, That is not my problem. The board expects compliance, and I am scheduling the inspection for this Friday at 10. I said, I will not be home Friday at 10. He said, Then we will conduct the inspection without you present. I said, You are not inspecting my car without me present. He said, Then you need to make yourself available. I said, No. He paused. Then he said, Refusal to comply with an inspection is grounds for a lien. I said, File the lien and I will sue you for harassment. He said, I am just doing my job. I said, Your job is illegal. Then I hung up. I called Marcus immediately. I said, They just threatened an inspection and a lien. He said, Based on what? I said, A guest log requirement I never heard of. He said, That is a new rule, and new rules require a vote and proper notice. Did you get notice of a vote? I said no. He said, then the rule is not enforceable. I said, they do not care. He said, they will care when the audit comes back. I said, when is that happening? He said, you filed Monday. Today is Wednesday. Give it another week. I said, they are not going to wait a week. He said, then you file the emergency motion and freeze them. I said, I will go tomorrow. He said, good, and bring the phone log from that call if you can. I said, I recorded it. He said, even better. I said, is that legal? He said, in South Carolina, yes, one-party consent. I said, okay. He said, you are doing great. Stay calm. I said, I am trying. He said, I know. Then he hung up. The next morning, I went back to the county clerk's office and asked for the emergency intake desk. A woman in a gray suit met me in a small conference room and said, what is the emergency? I said, the HOA is threatening an inspection without cause and a lien without a hearing. She said, do you have documentation? I said yes. I handed her the recorded call transcript, the email blast, the tow authorization slip, and the timeline of violations. She read through everything and said, this is clear harassment. I said, can you freeze them? She said, I can request a temporary restraining order on their enforcement powers pending the audit results, but you need to file a sworn statement that you are in immediate danger of financial harm. I said, I am. They are threatening a lien. She said, that is enough. She handed me a form and said, fill this out, sign it, and I will file it this afternoon. I said, how long until it takes effect? She said, 24 to 48 hours. I said, what if they try something before then? She said, call the police and reference the filing. I said, okay. She said, one more thing. If they violate the restraining order, that is contempt, and it carries penalties. I said, good. She said, you sound like you want them to violate it. I said, I want them to stop. She said, they will. I filled out the form, signed it, and left. That night, I got a text from an unknown number. It said, you are making this harder than it needs to be. The board is willing to waive the fines if you agree to follow the rules going forward. I did not respond. 10 minutes later, another text came. It said, ignoring this offer will result in escalated action. I still did not respond. My mother said, who is texting you? I said, someone from the HOA. She said, what do they want? I said, they want me to fold. She said, are you going to? I said, no. She said, what if they actually file the lien? I said, then I prove it is fraudulent and they pay damages. She said, you sound very sure of yourself. I said, I am sure of the law. She said, the law does not always work. I said, it works when you have proof. She said, I hope you are right. I said, I am. She said, okay. Then she went to bed. Friday morning at 9:30, I got a knock on my door. I opened it and found a man in coveralls holding a clipboard. He said, I am here to inspect your vehicle for the HOA. I said, no, you are not. He said, I have a work order. I said, show me. He held up the clipboard. The work order had my address and my plate number, but no signature and no date. I said, "This is not valid." He said, "The HOA hired me. I am just doing the job." I said, "The HOA does not have the authority to inspect my vehicle without my consent." He said, "They told me you would say that." I said they were right. He said, "I am going to do the inspection anyway." I said, "If you touch my car, I will call the police." He said, "Go ahead." I pulled out my phone and called the non-emergency line. The dispatcher said, "We have an officer in the area. He will be there in 5 minutes." I said, "Thank you." The man in coveralls said, "I am not waiting 5 minutes." Then he walked toward my car with a handheld scanner in his other hand. I followed him and said, "Do not touch my car." He said, "I am not touching it. I am scanning the plate." I said, "Scanning the plate is inspection without consent." He said, "It is public information." I said, "You are on HOA property, doing HOA work without authorization." He said, "I have authorization." I said, "Show me the signed work order." He said, "It is on the clipboard." I said, "There is no signature." He said, "It is electronic." I said, "Show me the electronic signature." He said, "I do not have access to that." I said, "Then you do not have authorization." He said, "You are wasting my time." I said, "You are trespassing." He said, "Call your lawyer." I said, "I already did." The police car pulled up, and the same officer from 2 nights ago got out. He said, "What is going on?" I said, "This man is attempting to inspect my vehicle without my consent under a work order that is not properly authorized." The officer said, "Can I see the work order?" The man in coveralls handed it over. The officer read it and said, "There is no signature and no date. This is not valid." The man said, "The HOA told me it was valid." The officer said, "The HOA does not have the authority to bypass consent requirements." The man said, "I am just doing my job." The officer said, "Your job is done. Leave the property." The man said, "I am not leaving until I complete the inspection." The officer said, "If you do not leave, I will cite you for trespassing." The man looked at me, looked at the officer, and said, "Fine." Then he walked back to his truck and drove off. The officer said, "You are having a rough week." I said, "You have no idea." He said, "I saw your emergency filing in the system. It should go through today or tomorrow." I said, "Thank you." He said, "If they send another vendor, call us immediately." I said, "I will." He said, "Good luck." Then he left. I went inside and called Marcus. I said, "They sent a vendor to inspect my car without consent." He said, "Did you stop him?" I said, "Yes. Police were here." He said, "Good. That is another violation." I said, "How many violations do we need before something happens?" He said, "The restraining order should be in place by tonight, and once it is, they cannot do anything without facing contempt." I said, "What if they do it anyway?" He said, "Then they get fined and possibly removed from the board." I said, "I want them removed from the board." He said, "Focus on the audit first. The removal will come if the audit is bad enough." I said, "It will be bad enough." He said, "I know." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because Karen is escalating, and escalation always leaves a trail." I said, "What kind of trail?" He said, "Emails, texts, vendor contracts, payment records." Once the auditor starts digging, they will find everything. I said, how long does an audit take? He said, 2 to 4 weeks, depending on how much they have to review. I said, I cannot wait 2 to 4 weeks. He said, you do not have to. The restraining order buys you time. I said, okay. He said, stay calm. You are winning. I said, it does not feel like winning. He said, it never does until it is over. Then he hung up. That afternoon, I checked my email and found a message from the county clerk's office. The subject line said, temporary restraining order approved. I opened it and read the details. The order prohibited the Stonehaven HOA from conducting any enforcement actions against my property, vehicle, or person pending the results of the compliance audit. It was effective immediately and valid for 60 days. Violation of the order would result in contempt charges and penalties up to $5,000 per incident. I printed the order and put a copy in my car, a copy on my front door, and a copy in the folder. Then I forwarded it to Marcus. He replied, this is huge. They cannot touch you now. I said, what if they try? He said, then you call the police, reference the order, and they get charged. I said, good. He said, now we wait for the audit. I said, how will I know when it starts? He said, the auditor will contact you for your evidence packet and interview. I said, okay. He said, when they do, give them everything. I said, I will. He said, and stay off the HOA's radar. Do not engage with Karen or anyone else on the board. I said, what if they contact me? He said, refer them to the restraining order and do not respond. I said, okay. He said, you are doing great. I said, I hope so. He said, you are, trust me. Then he hung up. 2 days later, I was in the driveway washing my car when a white sedan pulled up and Karen got out. She was wearing her black blazer and a reflective safety vest, and she had a clipboard in her hand. She walked up to me and said, I need to talk to you about the restraining order. I said, there is nothing to talk about. The order is in place, and you are prohibited from enforcement actions. She said, the order is a mistake. The board is appealing it. I said, good luck with that. She said, you are making this personal, and it is not personal. It is policy. I said, policy does not include backdated notices and forged authorizations. She said, nothing was forged. I said, the tow slip you showed me had a date that did not match the timeline. She said, the date was correct. You are misreading it. I said, the photo metadata proves otherwise. She said, photo metadata can be faked. I said, not by me. She said, you have been a problem since day one, and the board is tired of your attitude. I said, my attitude is not the problem. Your enforcement is. She said, you do not get an opinion. You get a fine schedule. I said, say that again. She blinked. I said, say it again so I can add it to the recording. She looked at my phone, which was sitting on the hood of my car, with the camera pointed at her. Her face went red. She said, you are recording me. I said, yes. She said, that is illegal. I said, one-party consent. Look it up. She said, this is harassment. I said, you came to my property. I am documenting it. She said, I am leaving. I said, good idea. She turned and walked back to her car, and I watched her drive away. I sent the video to Marcus. He replied, "She is digging her own grave." I said, "She is definitely digging something." He said, "Keep recording everything. The auditor will love this." I said, "When is the auditor coming?" He said, "Should be any day now." I said, "Good." He said, "How is your mother doing?" I said, "She is stressed, but okay." He said, "Tell her this will be over soon." I said, "I hope so." He said, "It will. Karen is out of moves." I said, "She does not act like she is out of moves." He said, "She is bluffing. Bluffing is all she has left." I said, "Okay." He said, "Trust the process." I said, "I am trying." He said, "You are doing fine." Then he hung up. That night, I got another email from the HOA master account. The subject line said, "Emergency Board Meeting and Enforcement Policy Revision." I opened it and read the first paragraph. It said, "Due to recent legal challenges, the board is holding an emergency meeting to review enforcement policies and ensure compliance with state regulations. The meeting will be held this Saturday at 10 in the community center. All homeowners are encouraged to attend." I forwarded the email to Marcus and said, "They are panicking." He replied, "Good. Go to the meeting and record everything." I said, "Should I bring the folder?" He said, "Yes, and sit in the front row." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because if they are revising policies, it means they know the audit is coming and they are trying to cover their tracks." I said, "Can they do that?" He said, "They can try. But if the auditor finds evidence of prior violations, it does not matter what they change now." I said, "Okay." He said, "Bring a witness if you can." I said, "My mother is not up for it." He said, "Bring the rideshare driver if you can find him." I said, "I do not have his number." He said, "Then bring your phone and record." I said, "I will." He said, "See you Saturday." I said, "Okay." He hung up. Saturday morning, I walked into the community center at 9:55. The room was half full, mostly older residents I recognized from the neighborhood. Marcus was already there, sitting in the second row. I sat in the front row and put my folder on my lap. Karen was at the front table with two other board members, a man in his 60s and a woman in her 50s. Karen was wearing her black blazer and the reflective safety vest, and she had a stack of papers in front of her. The man called the meeting to order at 10 and said, "We are here to discuss revisions to the parking enforcement policy in light of recent complaints." I raised my hand. He said, "We will take questions after the presentation." I said, "I have a restraining order that prohibits enforcement actions. Does that apply here?" He said, "The restraining order applies to individual enforcement, not policy discussion." I said, "Okay." He said, "Thank you." Karen stood up and said, "The board has reviewed the parking enforcement procedures and identified several areas for improvement." She pulled out a sheet and started reading. She said, "Effective immediately, all tow authorizations will require a photo of the violation, a timestamp, and a 48-hour notice period. All notices will be mailed and emailed with delivery confirmation. All appeals will be heard within 10 business days." I raised my hand again. She said, "Questions at the end." I said, "Do these revisions apply retroactively?" She said, "No." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because they are new policies." I said, So all the prior authorizations are still valid? She said, yes. I said, even the ones without photos or timestamps? She said, those authorizations were valid under the prior policy. I said, the prior policy violated state law. She said, that is your opinion. I said, it is the State Compliance Office's opinion. She said, we have not heard from the State Compliance Office. I said, you will. The room went quiet. Karen sat down, and the man at the table said, we are not here to litigate individual complaints. I said, this is not an individual complaint. This is a pattern of abuse that affects the entire neighborhood. A woman in the back row said, he is right. I got towed last month with no notice. Another man said, same here. They towed my son's car and charged me $400. Karen said, those were valid tows. The woman in the back said, no, they were not. I have the receipt and the date does not match. Karen said, the date is when we posted the notice, not when you saw it. The woman said, I never saw a notice. Karen said, that is not our problem. The man at the table said, okay, let us move on. I said, we are not moving on until you explain how you can revise policies without addressing the violations that happened under the old policies. He said, those violations are closed. I said, they are not closed, they are under audit. Karen's face went pale. The man said, what audit? I said, the State Compliance Office is conducting an audit of Stonehaven HOA's enforcement actions, and you should have been notified by now. He said, we have not been notified. I said, check your mail. The room erupted in whispers, and Karen stood up and said, this meeting is over. The man said, Karen, sit down. She said, I am not sitting down. He is disrupting the meeting. I said, I am not disrupting. I am informing. She said, you are grandstanding. I said, you are panicking. She said, you do not get an opinion. You get a fine schedule. The room went silent again. The man at the table said, Karen, that is not helpful. She said, I am done with this. Then she grabbed her papers and walked out. The man at the table said, we will reconvene in 2 weeks. Then he stood up, and the meeting ended. I stayed in my seat, and several residents came up to me. The woman who got towed said, thank you for speaking up. I said, no problem. She said, can I add my name to the complaint? I said, talk to the State Compliance Office. They will take your statement. She said, how do I contact them? I gave her the number, and she thanked me. Another man said, I have been fighting them for 6 months over a lien. Can I get a copy of your restraining order? I said, talk to the county clerk's office. They can help you file. He said, thank you. Marcus walked over and said, that was perfect. I said, Karen walked out. He said, because she knows she is done. I said, how do you know? He said, did you see her face when you mentioned the audit? I said, yes. He said, that was panic. I said, good. He said, the auditor will be here next week. I got the confirmation email this morning. I said, why did you not tell me? He said, I am telling you now. I said, okay. Be ready. They will want everything. I said, I have everything. He said, I know. Then he left. I went home and my mother said, how did it go? I said, Karen walked out. She said, is that good or bad? I said, Good, it means she is losing control. She said, what happens next? I said, the auditor comes next week and interviews me. She said, what will you tell them? I said, everything. She said, do you think they will believe you? I said, they will believe the evidence. She said, I hope so. I said, me too. She said, when will this be over? I said, soon. She said, you keep saying that. I said, because it is true. She said, okay. Then she went back to her room. Monday morning, I got a call from a number with a government area code. I answered and a woman said, this is Linda Chen from the State Compliance Office. I am the auditor assigned to the Stonehaven HOA case. I said, thank you for calling. She said, I have reviewed your complaint and supporting documents, and I need to schedule an interview with you. I said, I am available anytime. She said, how about tomorrow at 2? I said, that works. She said, I will also need access to any additional evidence you have, including video, emails, and receipts. I said, I have everything organized in a folder. She said, perfect. Bring it with you. I said, where should I meet you? She said, I will be at the Stonehaven Community Center conducting interviews all week. We can meet in the conference room. I said, okay. She said, one more thing. Do not discuss this interview with anyone on the HOA board. I said, I would not dream of it. She said, good, see you tomorrow. Then she hung up. I called Marcus and said, the auditor just called. Interview is tomorrow. He said, good, stick to the facts and let the evidence speak for itself. I said, should I bring you? He said, you can, but you do not need me there. I said, I want you there. He said, okay, I will meet you at 1:45. I said, thank you. He said, no problem. This is the easy part. I said, what is the hard part? He said, waiting for the results. I said, how long will that take? He said, 2 to 3 weeks. I said, that is a long time. He said, it is faster than most audits. You should be grateful. I said, I am. He said, good. Then he hung up. Tuesday afternoon, I walked into the community center with Marcus and my folder. Linda Chen was waiting in the conference room with a laptop and a legal pad. She said, thank you for coming. Let us get started. I sat down, and she said, walk me through your complaint. I started at the beginning. I said, I moved to Stonehaven 8 months ago, and within the first month I received a parking violation notice for a guest vehicle. The notice claimed the vehicle had been parked for 4 days, but the photo metadata showed the notice was taken 2 days after the vehicle left. She said, do you have the photo? I said, yes. I handed her the file. She reviewed it and said, this is a clear timeline inconsistency. I said, it gets worse. I walked her through the tow attempts, the backdated authorization slip, the email blast, the vendor inspection attempt, and Karen's repeated refusal to provide proper notice. She took notes and said, do you have recordings of your interactions with the board? I said yes. I played her the videos. She watched them all and said, this is egregious. I said, is that a legal term? She said, yes, it means the violations are serious enough to warrant penalties. I said, what kind of penalties? She said, fines, suspension of enforcement powers, and possible board removal. I said, I want board removal. She said, that is up to the state, but I will recommend it in my report. I said, when will the report be done? She said, 2 weeks. I said, thank you. She said, thank you for your documentation. It makes my job easier. I said, I am glad it helps. She said, you should consider a career in compliance. I said, I will stick to fleet mechanics. She smiled and said, fair enough. Then she closed her laptop and said, I will be in touch. I left the community center, and Marcus said, that went well. I said, she said it is egregious. He said, that is good. I said, I hope so. He said, it is, trust me. I said, I am tired of trusting people. He said, trust the evidence then. I said, I do. He said, good. Then we got in our cars and left. 2 days later, I was at the grocery store when I saw Karen in the produce section. She saw me and turned around. I kept walking. She followed me to the checkout line and said, you are proud of yourself. I did not respond. She said, you have no idea what you have done. I said, I know exactly what I have done. She said, the board is being investigated because of you. I said, the board is being investigated because they broke the law. She said, we did not break the law. We enforced policy. I said, your policy violated state regulations. She said, you are not a lawyer. I said, I do not need to be. I can read. She said, you think you are so smart. I said, I think you are careless. She said, what does that mean? I said, you left a trail. She said, there is no trail. I said, there is a trail of backdated notices, unauthorized tow slips, vendor payments, and email blasts. She said, that is all legitimate. I said, the auditor does not think so. She said, the auditor has not finished yet. I said, she will. Karen's face went red. She said, I have done this before, and people fold every time. I said, I am not people. She said, you are going to regret this. I said, I already regret living here. She said, you should move. I said, you should resign. She said, I am not resigning. I said, you will after the report comes out. She said, you do not know that. I said, I do. Then I paid for my groceries and left. That night I got a text from Marcus. He said, I heard Karen confronted you at the store. I said, how did you hear that? He said, someone on the board told me. They are scared. I said, good. He said, the report is due next week. Stay low until then. I said, I am trying. He said, I know. I said, what happens if the report clears them? He said it would not. The evidence is too strong. I said, but what if? He said, then you sue. I said, for what? He said, harassment, defamation, and abuse of process. I said, how much does that cost? He said, I will do it pro bono if it comes to that. I said, why? He said, because I hate bullies, and Karen is the worst kind. I said, thank you. He said, no problem. Now go rest. I said, okay. Then I hung up. The next week was quiet. No emails, no texts, no visits. I checked my car every morning, and it was still there. No clamp, no sticker. My mother said, it feels like the calm before the storm. I said, or the calm after. She said, I hope you are right. I said, me too. She said, when will we know? I said, the report is due Friday. She said, what if it takes longer? I said, then we wait. She said, I hate waiting. I said, me too. She said, you are very patient. I said, I am very stubborn. She laughed and said, that too. Friday morning, I woke up to an email from Linda Chen. The subject line said, Audit report complete. I opened it and read the summary. The report found that Stonehaven HOA had issued tow authorizations without proper notice in 14 cases over the past 6 months. It found that the board had failed to maintain meeting minutes for enforcement actions, violating state open meeting rules. It found that the board had used a preferred tow vendor without competitive bidding, creating a conflict of interest. It found that the board had issued defamatory communications about individual residents without cause. The report recommended that the HOA refund all tow fees, storage fees, and late charges issued without proper notice. It recommended that the board suspend all enforcement actions for 90 days. It recommended that the board president and compliance officer resign or face removal. It recommended that the HOA adopt new policies in compliance with state regulations and submit to quarterly audits for 2 years. I forwarded the email to Marcus. He replied, You won. I said, It does not feel like winning yet. He said, Wait until the board meeting next week. It will feel like winning then. I said, Okay. He said, Good job. I said, Thank you. He hung up. The board scheduled an emergency meeting for Monday night. I arrived early and sat in the front row with Marcus. The room filled quickly. Karen was at the front table with the same 2 board members from the last meeting. She looked tired. The man at the table called the meeting to order and said, We are here to discuss the audit report and the board's response. He read the summary out loud. When he finished, the room was silent. Then a woman in the back row stood up and said, I want a refund. Another man said, Me too. Karen said, The board will review refund requests on a case-by-case basis. I stood up and said, The report says refunds are mandatory, not discretionary. Karen said, You do not get to interpret the report. I said, I do not need to. The auditor already interpreted it. Karen said, You have been nothing but a disruption since you moved here. I said, And you have been nothing but a bully since I met you. The man at the table said, Let us keep this civil. I said, Civil ended when she tried to tow my car with a forged authorization slip. Karen stood up and said, Nothing was forged. I said, The date was backdated and the signature was not yours. Karen said, The signature was mine. I said, Prove it. She said, I do not have to prove anything to you. I said, You have to prove it to the state. She said, The state has no authority here. I said, The state has all the authority here. The man at the table said, Karen, sit down. She said, I am not sitting down. Then she looked at me and said, You think you won, but you did not. The board will fight this. I pulled out a folder and said, The board will lose. I walked up to the table and handed the man a packet. I said, This is a third-party compliance report that clears me completely and shows that Karen intentionally configured the gate system to lock me out and blame it on a glitch. The man read the first page and his face went pale. He said, Where did you get this? I said, A gate vendor service report proving the lockout was intentional configuration, not a glitch. The man said, This is serious. Karen said, That is a lie. I said, the vendor signed it. Karen said, the vendor is lying. I said, the vendor has no reason to lie. Karen said, you paid him to lie. I said, I did not pay him anything. He came forward on his own after the audit started. Karen's face went white. The man at the table said, Karen, if this is true, you are done. Karen said, it is not true. The man said, the vendor signed it and the state confirmed it. Karen said, the state is wrong. The man said, Karen, you are making this worse. She said, I am not making anything worse. He is the problem. I said, I am the solution. She said, you are nothing. I said, I am the reason you are about to lose your position. She said, I am not losing anything. The man at the table said, Karen, you are dismissed from the board effective immediately. Karen said, you cannot do that. He said, I just did. Karen said, this is illegal. He said, read the audit report. It is all legal. Karen grabbed her papers and said, I will sue. The man said, good luck with that. Then Karen walked out of the room. The entire room watched her leave. The man at the table said, the board will issue refunds within 30 days, and we will adopt the policies recommended by the state. I said, thank you. He said, thank you for bringing this to our attention. I said, you are welcome. Then the meeting ended. I walked outside, and Marcus was waiting by my car. He said, that was incredible. I said, it felt good. He said, Karen's credibility collapses in front of witnesses. I said, I think she deserves it. He said, she does. I said, what happens now? He said, the board has to publish standards and timelines to all homeowners, and Karen is out. I said, forever. He said, as far as Stonehaven is concerned, yes. I said, good. He said, you should celebrate. I said, I am too tired to celebrate. He said, fair enough. Then he got in his car and left. I drove home, and my mother was waiting in the living room. She said, how did it go? I said, Karen is out, and we are getting refunds. She said, really? I said, really? She said, I cannot believe it. I said, I can. She said, you look exhausted. I said, I am. She said, go rest. I will make dinner. I said, thank you. Then I went to my room and sat on the bed. My phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. It said, congratulations, you won. I did not recognize the number. I texted back, who is this? The reply said, the rideshare driver. I was at the meeting tonight, and I wanted to say good job. I said, thank you. He said, people like Karen need to be stopped. I said, I agree. He said, if you ever need a witness for anything, let me know. I said, I appreciate it. He said, no problem. Then the conversation ended. 2 weeks later, I got a check in the mail from Stonehaven HOA. It was a refund for all the tow fees, storage fees, and late charges they had issued. The amount was $1,200. I deposited it and sent a photo to Marcus. He replied, Justice. I said, finally. He said, how is your mother? I said, she is doing better. Less stress. He said, good. I said, thank you for everything. He said, anytime. I said, I mean it. He said, I know. Then he sent a thumbs up, and the conversation ended. That night, I was sitting on the couch when my mother came out and said, "I got a letter from the HOA." I said, "What does it say?" She said, "They are apologizing for the stress and confusion, and they are inviting all residents to a town hall to review the new policies." I said, "Are you going?" She said, "No, I have had enough of them." I said, "Me too." She said, "Do you think things will get better?" I said, "I think they have to. The state is watching them now." She said, "Good." She sat down next to me and said, "I am proud of you." I said, "For what?" She said, "For not giving up." I said, "I did not have a choice." She said, "You always have a choice. You chose to fight." I said, "I guess so." She said, "You did the right thing." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I love you." I said, "I love you too." Then we sat in silence and watched television. 3 weeks later, the HOA held the town hall. I did not attend, but Marcus did. He called me afterward and said, "They adopted all the new policies, they hired a new management company, and they are under quarterly audits for 2 years. I said, "What about Karen?" He said, "She did not show up." I said, "Where is she?" He said, "I heard she moved out of the neighborhood." I said, "Good." He said, "The board also issued a formal apology to you and posted it on the website." I said, "I did not see it." He said, "Check your email. They sent a copy to all residents." I checked and found the email. The subject line said, "Formal apology to resident." I opened it and read the message. It said, "The board regrets the enforcement actions taken against certain residents without proper notice and procedure. We apologize for the stress and inconvenience caused, and we commit to following state regulations and community standards going forward." I forwarded it to Marcus. He replied, "You won." I said, "I know." He said, "How does it feel?" I said, "It feels like I can finally breathe." He said, "Good." Then he hung up. A month later, I was walking to my car when I saw the tow yard receipt that keeps showing up in my mailbox one last time. I picked it up and looked at it. Same company, same blank line, same threat. I tore it in half and threw it in the trash. My mother came out and said, "What was that?" I said, "Nothing important." She said, "You look happy." I said, "I am." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because it is over." She said, "Is it really over?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good. I was getting tired of all the drama." I said, "Me too." She said, "What are you going to do now?" I said, "Live quietly and hope the HOA leaves me alone." She said, "They will. They have to." I said, "I hope so." She said, "They will. Trust me." I said, "I do." Then we got in the car and drove to the grocery store. That night, I was sitting on the couch when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Linda Chen. It said, "I wanted to let you know that the State Compliance Office has issued a public report on Stonehaven HOA, and it is available online." I opened the link and read the report. It detailed every violation, every backdated notice, every unauthorized tow, and every defamatory email. It recommended that an independent audit finds improper late fees tied to notices, and the HOA is forced to refund a large batch of charges across the neighborhood. The report concluded with a statement that Stonehaven HOA had violated state regulations and would remain under supervision for 2 years. I sent the link to Marcus. He replied, "This is huge. It is going to help a lot of people." I said, "I hope so." He said, "It will." Then he sent a thumbs up, and the conversation ended. I sat back and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, I felt calm. The stress was gone. The threats were gone. Karen was gone. The HOA was under supervision. My mother was recovering. My car was still in the driveway. No clamp, no sticker, no threat. I opened my eyes and looked around the room. Everything was quiet. Everything was normal. I smiled. I hope your fines stay at 0.